Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So today we're going to spend some time thinking about economic reasoning, neoliberalism, and how those concepts and how that shapes how governments make policies, the public policy making. Kind of connecting these discussions that we've been having about economic rationale, neoliberalism, and the public policy making progress. So in this video, we'll talk about two readings. Elizabeth Berman's Thinking Like an Economist, which shows us how a distinctive economic style of reasoning has taken root in the U.S. public policy making process, really gradually reshaping what kinds of policies were considered realistic, were considered legitimate. And so we talked about how, when we talk about, well, what is realistic in public policy, Berman has argued that there's a reason that certain public policies are portrayed as reasonable while others are not. So we'll talk about that, and we'll incorporate Manfred Steger's Neoliberalism, a very short introduction, which places this in a domestic as well as global context, showing how neoliberalism we know it's spread around the world, how it's spread across countries, but it has reshaped institutions globally, and how, of course, that has sparked some backlash against neoliberalism, while limiting, according to the authors, the public policy options that are available for countries to incorporate. So when these two readings are taken together, they teach us an interesting point that public policy decisions and public policy choices are not made in a vacuum. They are shaped and constrained by the intellectual tools that policymakers use, by the economic order in which governments are situated in, and, as we'll see, by social movements that contest those limits, the protests that try to change those limits. So we'll put our two readings that we had for this week and kind of see how they're talking to each other, see how they are making sense with each other. Let's start with Thinking Like an Economist in Policymaking. We'll start with Elizabeth Berman's piece. She asks, why do U.S. policymakers, even when they have political power and public support, so often pursue relatively modest technocratic reforms instead of bold or transformational programs, even if, when the politician, the elected official, was running for office, they talk about big, bold changes. But once they're in power, they see these more relative and around the margin changes. So that's what she sets out to understand. Her answer is that policymakers have come to adopt a particular lens, the economic style of reasoning. This style emphasizes efficiency, incentives, trade-offs, and markets. It frames problems in terms of optimization and cost-benefit analysis, rather than in terms of rights, equality, and justice. So she uses the example of healthcare. In 2009 and 2010, the Obama administration designed relatively large healthcare reform. There were many possible models that people were talking about at the time. Single payer, Medicare for all, universal public insurance. But these, at the time, were not seriously considered by the administration. Instead, policymakers built a system of private insurance exchanges, regulated to promote competition, a system that reflected market logic. The results, the Affordable Care Act, was significant but fell short of universal health care. So with this debate, we know continues in our public policy making perspectives. Maybe those on the further left still argue that Medicare for all or healthcare for all is a possibility. But she's arguing that the constraints of our political system the way it looks at economics, cost benefit analysis, and a desire to incorporate markets kind of hinders the reality of a single payer healthcare system. So she argued that the same dynamic appeared in financial reform after the 2008 global financial crisis. Rather than break up the largest banks or fundamentally restructure the financial system, policymakers focused on regulations to the markets function more smoothly. So making sure that markets themselves just worked the way they were supposed to. She brings up the issue of climate change. Democrats pushed cap and trade and cost benefit regulatory analysis rather than sweeping bans or mandates or stricter regulations. The framework of efficiency defined what counted as realistic to achieve in the policymaking realm. So what we see in each of these cases is the power of the economic style to narrow policy options. Let's repeat that. What we see in each of these cases is the power of the economic style to narrow policy options. Alternatives rooted in values like equality, justice, solidarity were sidelined if they did not fit this efficiency paradigm. So to understand why efficiency became so dominant, Berman takes us through a bit of a historical journey. Early in the 20th century, economists in Washington were often institutionalists, focused on law, history, social norms, or Keynesians, focused on managing the economy as a whole. But beginning in the 1960s, microeconomic reasoning rose to prominence. Analysts from the Rand Corporation and academic economists imported tools like optimization, rational choice modeling, and cost-benefit analysis into the policy-making process. They argued that government programs should be assessed not on values or rights, but on whether they produced efficient outcomes. Excuse me. Over time, these tools became embedded in government agencies, courts, and budget offices. By the 1980s and 1990s, the economic style had colonized everything from antitrust to education to healthcare to environmental regulation. This institutionalization mattered because it made efficiency the default way of thinking in Washington, D.C. By the time of the Clinton and the Obama administrations, Democratic policymakers had internalized this style of thinking in public policy making. Policy debates began not with the question, what should be the most just or fair, but rather, what would be the most efficient? The impact on policymaking is thus profound. The menu of policy options itself is shaped by this intellectual framework. So now let's think for a little bit about Steger's discussion about neoliberalism. So we see these ideas find their way into the policy-making process. But let's conclude our discussion about neoliberalism. We read for this week, chapter 6, the final chapter of our short reading. So if the economic style shaped domestic policy making in the US, neoliberalism also spread the market-first logic around the world. So neoliberalism, thus, is not just an ideology, it became a global policy-making regime. In the 80s and in the 1990s, international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank made structural adjustment a condition of loans, deregulation, privatization, and for countries to open their markets. Free trade agreements like NAFTA locked in roles favoring globalization, favoring an integrated global economy. This created what some scholars call the golden straitjacket. Countries could make many choices, but only within limits acceptable to global markets. If governments tried to pursue policies outside of neoliberal orthodoxy, such as heavy subsidies for industry, protectionism to grow infant industries, or expansive welfare states, they risked capital flight, debt crisis, and economic sanctions. So the result was that governments everywhere, not just in the US, adopted policies that prioritized markets, efficiency, and deregulation. But neoliberalism and this economic thinking has had some backlash. Movements like the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in '94, the Seattle WTO protests in 1999, and the Occupy Wall Street protests in 2011 mobilized against what they saw as inequalities of neoliberal globalization. These movements didn't always achieve policy victories, of course, but they did force debates about inequality, democracy, and global capitalism back into the policy-making circle. So, on a global scale, neoliberalism both narrowed policy choices and provoked contentious politics, which challenged those boundaries of how policymaking would be created. So what happens then when we put Berman and Steger together? We get a picture of a policymaking process of negotiation within constraints. The economic style of reasoning narrows the menu of legitimate policy options inside governments. Efficiency and markets defy what is feasible to pass with public policy. Neoliberal globalization imposes external limits. Policies must satisfy investors, international institutions, and global trade regimes. However, social movements and protests push back, reopening debates and demanding alternatives. So, policy making is not just about politicians making free choices. It is about navigating between intellectual frameworks, global pressures, and, of course, grassroots challenges. So, for us as a class that thinks about public policy, this perspective highlights three pretty interesting questions, three pretty big ideas and points. First, ideas do matter. The frameworks that policymakers use, in this case, economic reasoning, profoundly shape the policies that they design. If you believe that efficiency is the primary goal, you will design very different policies than if you prioritize equality or justice. So when we think about our public policy debates today, what is being debated? What type of public policy is being passed? We start to see this economic reasoning come into play, especially if we subscribe to the views that our authors put. And we'll read other pieces that kind of push back or say, and we talked about this in class, that that's okay. This idea of efficiency has actually created unprecedented economic growth, and it has created productivity increases. But our author here that we're trying to think about and understand where they're coming from is trying to bring to the forefront this idea that, okay, when we try to make sense of why some public policies are talked about and brought to the forefront, well, it's because of this idea of economic reasoning has come to the forefront. So second, we know that institutions matter. The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and even domestic policy, domestic agencies don't just implement policy, they define the boundaries of possibility. They enforce roles that governments feel they cannot break. And third, movements do matter. When policymakers become too constrained, contentious politics reopens debates. Protests like Occupy Wall Street or climate strikes do not always produce immediate legislation, but they do shape the environment in which policymakers operate. So, just to conclude, our big takeaways. Policymaking is not simply a technical process of experts solving problems. It is a deeply political process, shaped by ideas, shaped by institutions, and of course shaped by movements. So economic reasoning defines what looks reasonable or realistic. Neoliberalism, globalization sets global roles that governments feel compelled to follow. And protests and movements challenge those limits, demanding that justice, equality, and democracy be considered alongside efficiency. So, okay, if you made it to the end, I try to keep these under 20 minutes because I know it can be hard to engage and just listen. So if you made it to the end, I do thank you. That was our trying to connect Thinking Like an Economist, at least the first 2 chapters of Thinking Like an Economist by Elizabeth Berman, and our Manfred Steger's Neoliberalism, a very short introduction. So that was the final chapter in a very short introduction, and then our first 2 chapters of Thinking Like an Economist. Okay, so thank you.